Chapter 19, Ecologies, Part 2. Food chain. The diagram on the right depicts the nutritional relationship between organisms. A simple chain might involve algae, which are eaten by aquatic arthropods, which are eaten by minnows, which are eaten by bass. And in this case, the algae would be the producer and the other organisms would be consumers. Now, as you look at the energy that's flowing through a food chain, at each step in the food chain, there's like an 80 to 90% loss in energy. So of which we've talked about before, if 3,000 calories of light strike, let's say, a certain area on the Earth, and only 1,500 calories of those are absorbed by plants to produce food in the form of sugars that's stored and recycled. And then of that 1,500 calories, some of it is unusable materials that consumers can't benefit from. And then we have like the grasshopper that eats, he would be herbivore, and he would lose some of that energy from the grass that he eats, and 80 to 90% of that is lost energy, so that they would only get 15% of what's left. And then if the frog eats the grasshopper, the frog is now the secondary consumer, and it's a carnivore, and it 80 to 90% of the energy in the grasshopper is lost, and the frog only gets a small amount of what's left. And then if the frog, let's say, is eaten by a snake, then another 80 to 90% of that energy is lost. So whenever the energy is flowing, it always flows one way, from producer toward consumer. It never flows the other way. It's not a cycle that keeps repeating itself. So the next term that we need to define is detritus. This is the dead organic matter that you would find on the ground, mostly on the ground. This could be dead plants or animals or anything like that. All that would be detritus. And of that detritus, there's actually a food chain within that. Detritus, since it's dead decaying matter, we have the decomposers that will break down the plant matter or the animal matter. Mushrooms and things like that would fit into that category. And then we have the detritivores. These are the organisms that actually feed on the detritus, where they derive their own nourishment from that. Now, another way of looking at the energy relationship, we have talked about the food chain. Now let's talk about something called an ecological pyramid. And what an ecological pyramid does is it illustrates the nutritional relationship between different organisms. And as I said, it often portrays the energy relationship. And it's divided up into what we call trophic levels. And it shows the flow of matter and energy through the food chain. Here's an example of a ecological pyramid that's demonstrating this flow of energy through the chain. So we could start out with the algae. We've had this kind of in an earlier example. Algae, then, which are eaten by copepods, and copepods are like tiny arthropods that live in water. and then they in turn are eaten by minnows, and then minnows could be eaten by bass. So looking at the energy, if the algae has 1,000 calories, then 90%, we said 80 to 90%, let's say 90% of that energy gets to the copepods. When they are eaten by the minnows, of that 100 calories, only 10 is available to the minnows, and then only 1 calorie is available to the bass. So the energy at each level is 80 to 90% of it is lost. Now, another way of looking at the ecological pyramid is based on population size. So this one's kind of looks a little bit strange, but there are fewer trees, but in those trees can be many insects, and those insects are eaten by fewer birds. So that's the reason why it's getting smaller toward the top, because there's fewer birds than there are insects, and the trees are also small in number, or few in number. Now, biomass is the measure of the total mass of living tissue in a population or an ecosystem. And healthy ecosystems are supported by greater amounts of biomass than unhealthy systems. So forests or rainforests particularly would have a lot more biomass. Now, some of that biomass can be in different forms. The animals down at the bottom, animals residue could be part of that. The trash that we dump, the solid waste, is part of that biomass. Sewage is also part of that biomass. Agricultural crops is part of that biomass, and even the residue that's left over after they harvest is part of that. Crops and residue from trees, the wood and the bark and the leaves and things like that. And even industrial residue is part of that biomass. So in the biomass, we have the primary producers, and then that biomass can be consumed by the primary consumers. Those would be like the herbivores. And then we have secondary consumers, or that eat those primary consumers. And then tertiary consumers, as you can see, just keeps on going like that. That the biomass is in all these different levels. Now, biodiversity is another term. It's a measure of the number of different species within a system. And generally, ecosystems with a high biodiversity tend to be more productive and adaptable to change than those with lower diversity. So if there's a lot of different plant species, different animal species living in the same place, then that would have high biodiversity. If you had very few plants with very few animals living within it, maybe more like a desert, then it would have lower biodiversity. The top one is going to be able to, the higher one with higher biodiversity is going to be able to adapt to change better than the other one. So food web is another term that we sometimes use and to describe relationships, and they can describe multiple relationships at the same time. The arrow always points from the food source to its consumer. So if we would start down on the bottom where we have the mouse is food to, let's say, the hawk. It's food to the snake. It's food to the owl. It's food to the fox. But the mouse eats plants, so we have an arrow pointing toward it. And so over on the left, we have different relationships as well that show how they're all interconnected. So the next thing we want to talk about is species interactions. How does one species in an ecosystem or uh, interact with others? Now, the first one we're going to talk about is one called mutualism. Um, and to the right of this, we have two zeros in parentheses. The first zero is going to be one species. The second zero is going to represent the other species. And in mutualism, there's no direct relationship between the two. They just happen to live together. They don't compete with each other for anything. They just happen to be in the same area, but no relationship to each other. So neither one is harmed or benefited, and so we put a zero for each. Another kind of interaction is one of competition. This would be where we have animals that inhibit each other because they're depending on the same uh, resource of some kind. That could be they maybe eat the same food. Like for instance, fox and coyotes uh, don't do well in the same area because they're competitors. They both like the same food, and so usually you'll either have a larger population of fox and few coyotes, or the reverse, where you have lots of coyotes and few fox. Uh, Another species interaction is one of predation, where one is the predator and the other one is the prey. And in this one of them is harmed and the other one is benefited by by that relationship. So one population eats the other. So the one on the left is negative, so that would be the prey. The one on the right is positive, so that would be the predator. So if we look at these that we've talked about so far, uh, you have mutualism. Neither species benefits or is harmed. They just happen to be together. Competition, they both are harmed by that. Each one is eating the other one's food or living in the same place where they like to build the same nests. In many ways, they are competing. The predator situation, we have species A is the prey and species B is the predator. So one benefits, one does not benefit. Now, another term that comes up in this discussion often is symbiosis. It's a close relationship between two organisms that are of different species, and this relationship could benefit only one of them, or both of them, or it could, or even one could be harmed. In the one on the left, we have like a crocodile, and then we have a bird that uh, pecks around inside the mouth, picking out food debris. And so the crocodile does benefit somewhat, and the bird clearly benefits by finding sources of food. Uh, on the right, we have Nemo uh, living where uh, he's protected. So there could be uh, only one benefiting in that situation. Another term is amensalism. Amensalism, and one population is inhibited or harmed by a second population, and the second population is not affected by the first. So one population is inhibited, the other one is not, and this sometimes is a situation where one maybe secretes a chemical that maybe it's part of its waste, but when the waste product builds up to some level, it may cause another animal to either be sick or maybe even die. Parasitism is where you have you have to have a host. One organism is the host and the other one is the benefit. beneficiary of that relationship. So in our minus and plus up there, the minus would be the host and the plus would be the animal that's benefiting from or is drawing nourishment or something from the other one. Now, in this, they're almost all, as the name implies, they're parasites. We have endoparasites. These are ones that live inside the host, like tapeworms and flukes that we have talked about in previous chapters. They benefit from the host. They derive all their nourishment from the host. As we learn, they don't even have their own digestive systems or a way of eating because they're just absorbing food that's already been pre-digested for them. Then we have ectoparasites, like this mosquito that it shows here in the picture. They live on the outside of the host. The mosquito benefits clearly by this, so that's the plus on the right, and we have to live with the itch. So ticks, fleas, mosquitoes, all would be called ectoparasites, and their species relationship is parasitism. Another term is called commensalism, and in commensalism, one population benefits the other not helped or harmed by it. Like for instance, this whale has barnacles on it, and the barnacles provides housing, place for it to attach, and it provides transportation to another place. We also talked about lamprey eels in a previous chapter that suck onto the side of a fish and are transported around. They also, I guess in that case, it's probably more like a parasite because they do derive nourishment from their host. Okay, our last one is mutualism. This is where both species benefit. It's beneficial to both species. And within that, we can divide it up into two categories. Obligatory, where neither organism would survive without the other. And then we have, that would be such as the protozoans that we said live in the digestive tract of the termite. Remember, termites can't digest cellulose that's found in the wood that they eat, but these protozoan can digest the cellulose, and they both benefit from that. And the termite digestive system provides a nice place to live for the protozoan. Lichens are like that, where you have a fungus and an algae that are growing together, and they both benefit by that relationship. But it doesn't have to be obligatory. Like an example would be are the tick birds that are found in Africa that live on the back of animals, wild animals that are grazing, and they are picking off the ticks and the other parasites that the grazer has on its back. So if the animal grazer could survive